So this is week 75 of our weekly discussions. And this week we're talking about career choice, comparing 80,000 hours as advice to St. Ignatius of Loyola's discernment. And real quick, what is effective altruism, or EA? It's two things. It's an idea and it's a community focused on using evidence and careful reasoning to figure out the very best ways to improve the world and then to act on that basis. We are the Christian group within EA. So we think that EA is a great way for Christians to better discern how to live out their altruism in this world. And hopefully today will be helpful for that. So as a roadmap for today's discussion, I want to unpack some of these terms I use. What is 80K or 80,000 hours? Who was St. Ignatius of Loyola? And what is his guide for spiritual discernment? And then I want to just ask questions. Where are there synergies and tensions between these two? 80,000 Hours is a London-based nonprofit that conducts research on which careers have the largest positive social impact, and it provides career advice based on that research. I think many of us on this call have encountered 80,000 Hours. It's a really well-known org within the effective altruism space. I learned about effective altruism through 80,000 Hours when I was Google searching about 5 years ago how I could have an impactful career. And they now provide counseling for hundreds, maybe thousands of people a year. They also have a job board where they upload a couple hundred different high impact jobs across many different domains. And yeah, they've been very, very influential, especially their advice. I want to summarize their advice. They have a 2-minute summary on their website, which you can find. If I don't do it justice, you can go straight to the source. Their first piece of advice is to focus on a more pressing problem and to use a specific tool to do that. So a lot of us, when we enter our career, maybe we have a sense of a problem that's worth tackling. Maybe that's child hunger, or maybe that's the lack of a certain high quality product in the market. But 80,000 Hours says, find a more pressing problem. And this is extremely important to do, because what most people think is that the difference in importance between problems is like a linear difference, where all problems are relatively important to, but some are just a little bit more important than others. And that's just what we intuitively think. But their argument is that in reality, some problems are orders of magnitude more important than others. And we can use something called TNI, or a tractability, neglectedness, and impact framework, to figure out what problems are the most important. That means looking at problems that are T tractable, or that we can actually solve if we're trying to tackle it. Looking at problems that are N neglected, problems that currently don't have people working on it, and problems that are I important, or have a very large scale, affect a lot of people, or affect people in a very significant way. So for instance, we can think of saving some animal from extinction, maybe some very specific species of lizard that maybe doesn't play a key role in a specific ecosystem, but maybe doesn't have anybody working to protect it right now. The tractability for that might be very high. Maybe we know ways we can help this lizard. Maybe the neglectedness is also very high. Maybe there's no one working on it, but maybe the importance is relatively low compared to other causes like global hunger or whatever it may be. So the other key point of their advice is to find a more effective solution. And similar to this first set of graphs, the idea here is that some solutions or interventions within a specific problem are not just a little bit better, they're a lot better, they're a ton better, they're so much better that it would be worth putting one more resource in the most effective solution than 10 or 100 more resources in the least effective solutions. We see this in the health space very clearly. And if you use that as an analogy that predicts well for other problem areas, then it seems plausible. The third piece of advice is to find a path with more leverage. And your leverage is just how many resources you're able to mobilize towards the solution. So maybe you might think of solving a problem yourself, but maybe you can find some other person who can advocate to solve this problem by harnessing the efforts of dozens of other people. And then finally, find work that fits you better. Find work that's meaningful, that gets you in a state of flow, that fits your talents and interests and so forth. I want to contrast this, since all this is probably pretty reviewed to many of us here in this call. I want to contrast and compare this with discernment, especially in the Christian sense. And I want to draw from one specific Christian thinker who is actually over 500, it was around over 500 years ago. So quite an old thinker, but one that's influenced the church quite widely, especially the Catholic Church. Though I think he was around in a pre-Reformation time. So this isn't particularly a Catholic, distinctly a Catholic insight that he offers. And his name was Saint Ignatius. Who was Saint Ignatius of Loyola? Well, he is now known as a saint. He co-founded the religious order, the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. And again, he's born about 500 years ago into nobility, very well-to-do family, and spent much of his time following up in courtly life as a suitor, looking for someone to court and to marry, and was very involved in that. And he was also involved in war and military life, as his status kind of demanded of him. And one day, I think when defending a castle in France, he was struck between the legs by a cannonball and was bedridden afterwards. It just totally crushed the bones in his legs. And while he was away in bed, he spent a lot of time thinking about life. He started daydreaming of lots of things. The first thing he daydreamed of was just courtly love, like finding someone that he could marry, and how he would pursue this woman and so forth. And he realized that when he thought about this, it left him feeling strangely empty, left him feeling drained and a bit meaningless. And then he started to daydream about what it would be like if he used this opportunity to change his life, to turn around, to pursue God's call for his life, and to do that radically. And he realized that when he thought about a spiritual life, he started feeling joy, and he started feeling peace and contentment. And he reflected on these different interior states of his emotions. And he said that these are like different spirits. And he considered the former, the sort of emotional state that left him feeling empty and meaningless, as a spirit of the enemy or of the devil. And the latter, one where he felt joy and he felt meaning and purpose, a spirit of God. And so he created a manual, actually, the spiritual exercises, which people would use to go on retreats to try to discern for their own life, big picture decisions in their life, like what job should I take, or should I make this massive decision? And he gives his advice on how to decide between alternative things. It always involves choosing between good things. So for instance, between choosing to take this career path or choosing to marry this person. It also assumes that the person deciding has a loving relationship with God. And it always relates to some kind of inner struggle. So whereas 80,000 hours might look at a lot of the world's problems, and maybe as only a fourth and final point, focus on personal fit, St. Ignatius's writings really focuses on this inner struggle and where a person's heart and mind is going. So I want to briefly address what exactly he recommends. I'm not an expert on him. I took much of this content from Marquette University's article on this. There's a reverend there who wrote some upshots from St. Ignatius's writings. And St. Ignatius focuses on specific attitudes you need to have in order to make the right decision. And many of these I don't think are really controversial. He talks about having an open mind, basically being open to change your mind on whatever decision you're considering to make. Really having a generous spirit, really wanting to use your resources to help others. Talks about having courage, being willing to take the tough choice, even if that's not what you want to do. Interior freedom, not doing something because somebody else is telling you to do it, but really purity of the will here. Also a habit of prayerful reflection on one's own experience, especially daily prayer. Also having one's priorities straight, and also not confusing ends with the means. So if you're considering between marriage and a career, not making marriage or the career the end all be all, but rather thinking of this as a means to some other greater end. Maybe that's joy in your own life, but Ignatius recommends just as an end of all, God's really achieving what God wants and bringing God praise and glory. So Ignatius gives 7 practical techniques, and I think this is where we're going to find some interesting connections with some of the 80,000 hours advice. So Ignatius says to put in your mind specifically what decision you would like to decide. This kind of reminds me of when 80,000 hours asks at the end of their survey, is there any, or even at CEA events, they'll ask, is there any one specific choice that you're considering making in the near future? So make that very clear for yourself. What is it that you're deciding here? Are you deciding between 100 different alternatives, or are you actually at some kind of decision point? So Ignatius says, make it practical, decide specifically what you'd like to decide. Also pray for the grace to be unbiased, to make some kind of choice, not just with reference to yourself, but with reference to what God wants in some kind of unbiased way. That ties into point 3. But also, and I think this is very interesting, Ignatius writes about imagining yourself from somebody else's perspective, and imagining what they would say about the decision you're about to make. And this reminds me of sort of like a John Rawls veil of ignorance, where maybe that's a bit of a rabbit hole, but imagining from the state of some other almost eternal perspective, like imagining 2 different worlds, and imagining the one you would want to live in a similar vein, imagining your life from somebody else's perspective. What would they say about the decision you're considering making? Also imagine at the end of your life, when you look back on this decision, are you going to have tremendous regret based off of deciding it one way or another? Use reason. Ignatius writes, consider trade-offs. He doesn't use the word trade-off, but he says consider alternatives, and look at the pros and cons, or look at what goes for or against each one. And in all of this, just seek God's confirmation and his presence. And his presence is verified by a sense of blessing and of love and of peace. So I'm very curious, as we start into breakout rooms, have you thought about your career through an 80,000 hours perspective? Like I mentioned, for me, it was pretty impactful. At least this got me on the road to effective altruism. I'm curious if you've engaged with 80,000 hours before, and what that's been like for you. Do you see any contradiction between Ignatius's discernment and an 80,000 hours approach? And then is there anything particular from St. Ignatius's discernment of spirits that seems valuable to you?